finally, good morning. Yeah. And a hearty welcome to you brave souls who have agreed to sign up for a day-long immersion in an ocean full of ideas and issues that will leave you both exalted and exhausted. We thank you for coming and promise that your heroic effort will not have been in vain. Though we never have a formal theme for university for a day, America and the world always seems to fit the bill. We Americans tend to see ourselves at once a part of the world, and apart from the world. That is, separate and different from the world. We have been known to be self-absorbed and exceptionalistic. Winston Churchill once observed that we Americans always do the right thing once we've exhausted all other options. Daniel Boorstin, the late Librarian of Congress, once gave a lecture called The Fertile Verge, complimenting us on being a different and perhaps better America in every generation. My favorite description of us came from the curmudgeony of brilliant immigrant from Australia, art critic Robert Hughes, who said that as a country, he described us as a country whose making never ends. I really like that. We Americans tend to have hope, notwithstanding the troubles of our times, which, like the generation that precedes, all the generations that preceded us, we see as uniquely terrible. Optimism can be naive if it comes from a total denial of reality, but when it is a measured and deliberate mindset, you might say slightly disingenuous, that can give us the will, the skills, and the energy to change the world, I think we should hang on to it. Which leads me to our first lecture. But before that, I do want to thank our most generous benefactors, the Scranton Area Foundation and the Neighborhood Development Trust Fund, for supporting University for a Day. And now, Daniel Dzurec, Associate Professor of History here at the university, taught a Schemmel course on exceptionalism that some of you remember last year. I'm sure that's one of the big reasons that you're here. And many of you have had the opportunity to take. It's not an easy subject as it has to do not just with facts, but with attitudes, and it's very tricky. He did it by century, and when he came to the 17th, he focused on the Dutch and the special, one could say exceptional, culture that they brought to the New World. That culture, and we call it pluralism, some of us do, has had a profound impact on our identity and our public policies. So please join me in welcoming David Dzurec to the podium to ask us to remember that old New York was once New Amsterdam.
Thank you, Sandra, and thank you all for coming today. Like Sandra mentioned, this came out of a class I was teaching in American exceptionalism, and it sparked my interest, and I think many of the students in that class as well. And so what I'd like to do today is build on that class from last fall and go from there. And so to do that, I want to start with the Separatists. King James' ascension to the English throne in 1603 marked the beginning of a new wave of troubles for the nation's religious dissenters. Puritans, in particular, received special attention from James when, in a gathering of advisors, he declared, "I shall harry them out of the land." In the face of this growing pressure and imprisonment, one group, known as the Separatists, we have come to call them the Pilgrims, decided to leave England for a land where they could practice their faith in peace, where they would not be imprisoned for their belief, where they would not be forced to pay taxes to support a religion they did not believe in. This destination was, of course, the Netherlands. Right? This varies from the traditional narrative. Right? The Pilgrims we associate with coming to America, with coming to New England and establishing a colony. But in 1608, they chose the Netherlands because it was a place of religious toleration. They chose the Netherlands because of its reputation as welcoming to religious dissenters. And that's exactly what they found. When they traveled to the university town of Leiden, they settled there, they established themselves there, they established their church. But what they found in many ways, to their great dismay, was that there was too much freedom. They, without the threat of the king, without the threat of imprisonment, they actually began to fight among themselves. They began to fight over issues of infant baptism. They began to fight over issues of ministers. They began to fight over locations of churches. More even than that, they were concerned that their children were becoming too Dutch. The freedom of the Netherlands was alluring to their children, and they weren't strictly adhering to their religious code. They weren't strictly adhering to the beliefs of their parents. And so they decided it was time to leave. And these pilgrims then left not a land that was too repressive, but somewhat ironically too free, to come to the Americas and establish a colony in the Mayflower in 1620. When American students are often asked about why the Pilgrims came to North America, they say religious freedom. And as I've just outlined, that's true, but only to a point. Their interest wasn't in freedom so much for themselves, or for everyone else, but simply for themselves. Right? They wanted freedom to practice their faith as they saw fit. They weren't terribly tolerant of others, especially generations later when you had dissenters who were shipped off to establish Rhode Island. When the Quakers came in, the Quakers were seen as a great threat. They wanted no one but Puritans and later Congregationalists, which was the state-sponsored religion of Massachusetts. So what I want to talk about today then is not the Pilgrims, but the place they went to first. So we'll start with the Dutch Empire. Right? The Dutch Empire, with only 2 million residents in the 16th and 17th century, managed to become one of the major players on the sort of global economic stage. Right? They had an empire that stretched from Indonesia to South Africa to the Caribbean and ultimately to North America. They did this in part by using this idea of joint stock companies. It was this sort of modern economic idea that allowed them to sort of have investors share the risk of traveling overseas and the rewards in some cases. They also had, and what attracted the Pilgrims, a tremendous devotion to liberty. And if you look at the ideals and if you look at the character of the Dutch Republic of this era, it looks to us strikingly modern. Right? This devotion to liberty, a freedom of the press, tremendous upward mobility, tremendous religious toleration. It wasn't freedom so much as toleration. Right? They simply sort of allowed different groups to come into their country, to their republic, and exist. Right? They still sort of believed that the Dutch Reformed Church was the true church, but they tolerated others who came in. And you had French Huguenots, you had the Pilgrims, you had Jews from around the world who came to the Netherlands looking for that toleration, looking for that freedom. Part of this, too, is that they were a republic. Right? They lacked a sort of true central state. And the diversity of a republics sort of inherently with these different pieces that are brought together under a single umbrella, lead to this need for toleration because you have these differences of ideas. And strikingly, John Adams himself in 1782 said, speaking of the United States and the Netherlands, that the originals of the two republics are so much alike that the history of one seems to be but the transcript from that of the other. So Adams in 1782 saw similarities between the Dutch Republic and the young American Republic. It's that republic in this vein of sort of expansion and an economic gain that they hired a British and English explorer, Henry Hudson, to sail for the Dutch East India Company, ostensibly and initially to look for a Northwest Passage, right, to look for a water route through North America. And on several occasions he believed he had found it, right, and these two waterways now bear his name. Right. First he sailed up the Hudson River, began to sail north. He believed that any minute he'd come out in the Pacific, right, not fully understanding how much further he had to go. But you can understand this, right? If you're down in Manhattan, the Hudson River looks big, right? By the time you get north of Albany, it's a little less promising. But also in Hudson Bay. And this is actually as far as we know, his final resting place. He had sailed again on another voyage trying to find the Northwest Passage. He sailed with his crew. It was getting later and later in the year. And he said, just a little further, we'll come out in the Pacific. We'll be able to resupply. Everything will be fine. And his crew was less and less faithful, eventually mutinying and leaving him in a landing craft in the middle of the bay that bears his name. They turned around, and only about half of them made it back because they were right. They were going to run out of supplies, and winter was coming fast. But it was those failed efforts to find a Northwest Passage. In many ways, he was just about, 400 years too early, right? It's coming now. We'll fight with Canada and the Russians. But it's those failed efforts that allowed the Dutch to establish claims on what is today New York. The boundaries of the Dutch West India Companies, they created the Dutch West India Company to manage this territory. The boundaries stretched down to what they called the South River, or today the Delaware River, as up to the Hudson River, which they called the North River, and as far east as what we would call the Connecticut River today, the Fresh River. So these are the boundaries of the Dutch West India Company's fort. They established Fort Orange, what is today Albany, in 1617 as a trading outpost. And issues of trade are what brought the Dutch to this territory. Right? This was their primary goal, trade with the Native Americans in the region. And this would dominate much of their mission, much of what they're trying to do. They set aside missionary work, in part because of where they were coming from. There wasn't a real sort of religious impulse coming out of the Dutch Republic. And in 1624, they were given provincial status within the Dutch Empire. That also meant that there was a great need to increase the population. And they did this, they allowed many settlers from around Europe to come into this territory. You had French settlers, you had Dutch settlers, you had German settlers, Belgian settlers. Right? So from the very beginning, they're inviting in a wide, from a 17th century perspective, diverse population, right, into this territory, into this region. That diversity posed something of a challenge. Right? The diversity in a fairly wide swath of territory, governing that territory, but also in terms of who's there, right? Trying to sort of bring them all together into one unit. One of the first efforts to try to unite the colony to a degree is Peter Minuit's effort to move the capital to what is today Manhattan, and his famous purchase of Manhattan in 1626. Right? This is sort of a notorious, it's come to be a notorious purchase in that he paid, I'm trying to find the exact phrasing. I don't have the exact number, but he paid the equivalent of about 40 pounds of beaver pelts, right, for this territory. And people sort of say, look at this amazing land deal, you know, he really sort of gave the Indians a short end of the stick in this negotiation. But if you put it in a broader context, it's a bit more of a cultural misunderstanding than a sort of land deal sort of heavily favored towards the Dutch. Because the way that the tribe that sold him this territory viewed it wasn't so much as an out-and-out purchase, but as more of a lease or the right to travel through the territory. And in fact, Manhattan would have Native Americans living on it until the 1680s. Right? So they remained even after they theoretically sold this land. So it was more of a shared use policy than an out-and-out purchase, right? The way that's sort of come down within American lore and myth. Once he had made this purchase, he was in sort of this ideal location to try to unify the colony, because this was a major port, and is to this day, a major port on the eastern seaboard. And it allowed him to establish what was effectively a company town in the form of New Amsterdam. Right? This was not yet simply a chartered city within the Dutch Empire, but literally a company town run by the Dutch West India Company. Right? And so the people who lived there were more employees than citizens. And this was somewhat problematic, again, for trying to govern this territory, because these are employees whose goal is to make money. And so they weren't always sort of civic-minded, more than they were trying to make a bargain with the Indians or creating separate deals with the Indians or different groups of Indians and causing conflict. They also tended to be somewhat rowdy when they weren't bargaining. So you had lots of taverns, you had brothels, you had a rough and tumble port city within what is today New York. On top of those internal challenges, there's a growing threat from New England, especially when the New Englanders, who the Dutch called Yankees, this, by the way, roughly translated was land pirate. And it referred to New Englanders. So with apologies to the New York baseball fans, Yankees is New Englanders. So you've got some issues there, right? But the New Englanders had settled a colony, or an outpost, a city in Hartford, right on the Connecticut River, right on what the Dutch saw as their eastern boundary. And as the numbers of New Englanders continued to grow, there's external pressure to do something to deal with the sort of border threat, and internal pressure of trying to bring some sort of organization to this city with diverse and separate interested citizens or subjects. Minuit's term ends without much fanfare, in part because he's not able to bring a lot of sort of order to this territory. And he's replaced by William Kieft, who mismanages things terribly. The company is not doing terribly well. There's pressure on him to cut costs. And he bungles Indian relations terribly, so much so that there is an Indian war. Right? And here, the purpose of the colony is trade. The purpose of the colony is to work with Native Americans. And Kieft sort of so mismanages things that it breaks down into violence. Many subjects of the town are terribly upset by this, right? Because their goal had been to make money, and things had been so mismanaged that you have violence and you don't have a lot of trade when there's a war going on. And so, largely because his own subjects sort of push back against him, he's removed from power and replaced by Stuyvesant. Right? Peter Stuyvesant is brought in because there's a recognized need for order. Right? There's an understanding of the external threat coming from New England, and there's an understanding of the internal sort of disorder that exists in New Amsterdam. And so he comes in and he does that. He brings order. He helps sort of stabilize things. He begins to develop an infrastructure. He builds roads. He helps establish schools. Right? He develops external relations with New Englanders. He actually recognizes that Connecticut's sort of the real threat, so he goes to Massachusetts and begins to negotiate with the governor of Massachusetts to try to calm things down there. And he does fairly well. They establish a treaty. They do say that what is today the Connecticut River will be the eastern boundary. And he basically gives up nothing. So he helps secure the borders. He does bring some order and calm to the internal structure of the territory. But he also does it heavy-handedly. He doesn't do it with much popular support. He himself doesn't like the religious diversity and the toleration that he's experiencing in New York. He believes that everybody should be a member of the Dutch Reformed Church. And it's only with the pressure of the Dutch West India Company that he agrees to allow this diversity, in part because many of the investors in the company itself are from a broad range of religious backgrounds. So they say, we know you're our man over there, you're going to have to listen to us, and you're going to have to extend this toleration. But to his dying day, he grumbled about all the diversity. One of the people who pushed back against him is Adrian van der Donck. Van der Donck was a well-educated man from the Netherlands. He's sent over initially to sort of help establish the rule of law in the northern parts of the colony. And he had studied men like Grotius, right? And his understanding of natural law in many ways can be seen as sort of a, hesitate a little bit to say, but sort of a proto-enlightenment, right? Anticipating the growth of Enlightenment thinking and this idea of natural rights, right? That human beings have certain inherent rights, right? So he brings that idea over with him as he begins to try to establish legal foundations in New Netherlands. He does this in many ways, and ultimately to the great displeasure of Peter Stuyvesant. Van der Donck becomes one of his greatest critics, so much so that Stuyvesant has him jailed because he's seen as a threat. He's a threat to order. And remember, that was sort of Stuyvesant's charge as he was brought over: impose order, organization, structure. And when Van der Donck is released, he writes what's called the Remonstrance of New Netherland. He uses this remonstrance, drawing on this idea of natural rights, of the rule of law, and ultimately, after leaving prison, travels back to the Netherlands to try to have Stuyvesant removed from his position. And he actually is initially successful, because he, with the support of many of his fellow subjects, make the case to the Dutch that Stuyvesant is sort of running the colony into the ground, and that it will do better if they allow greater freedoms. Unfortunately for Van der Donck, the First AngloDutch War breaks out, just as he's finally convinced the company to let him take over. And he actually has the piece of paper in his hand, removing Stuyvesant from power, and is preparing to return to North America when the war breaks out. The company revokes Vanderdonk's orders to remove Stuyvesant, and Stuyvesant is left in control, largely because the West India Company is concerned about the war. And they know they're going to need a strong man there to sort of keep things moving in the correct direction. It's in this time, and Stuyvesant remains, and he remains sort of in his same position, that the city is actually granted its first charter. And it moves from being simply a company town. And some of this is the outgrowth of Vanderdonk's efforts. Right? That you have now not just a company town, but an actual chartered city in New Amsterdam within the Dutch Republic. What's fascinating, and here again you can see sort of some precursors to what we would think of as American ideals, is that everyone in the town, in the city of New Amsterdam, is granted burgher status. Right? And this would, in sort of the British tradition, be called freeman status. Right? There are two classes. There are great burghers and small burghers. Right? I know, sounds like we're ordering lunch now. And the great burghers are those who have given larger amounts of money. Right? Right. But here's the fascinating thing. The small burgher status is a relatively small amount of money. Right? It's about 20 pounds you can pay in beaver pelts, you can pay in kind, but you just have to pay some. I mean, it's almost a token amount. And as immigrants arrived from all over, Europe primarily, they were greeted with that opportunity and told if you can pay now, you'll be granted small burgher status immediately, or you can pay it off over time and still have burgher status.
Good question. It's only the men, right?
Yes. Yeah, no, this is not yet. Yeah. Yes, there are a lot of things that you sort of take for granted when you're talking about the 17th century. So sexism is one of them. But it's still a striking step forward from our perspective, right? So you have incredibly high rates of burgher status. When you compare that with New England, the freemen in New England never got much higher than 20%. Right? So there's that juxtaposition. Right? Things continue to get worse. Even after the First AngloDutch War comes to an end, tensions continue to rise in the Connecticut border. Connecticut is granted its own new charter and actually absorbs New Haven in 1661 under John Winthrop, who is not the Massachusetts governor, but his son in Connecticut. And Winthrop gains this charter from the king, and it grants him basically everything all the way to the Pacific Ocean within the Connecticut boundaries, which includes a good chunk of New York, right? This is why, and this charter would stay in effect well into the 19th century in terms of what Connecticut's land claims are. This is why in Northeast Ohio you have Case Western Reserve University, because that part of what is today Ohio was Connecticut's Western Reserve. So that carries over. This doesn't bode well for the Dutch, because now Connecticut theoretically has right to come and take a good chunk of their land. And they know this. As tensions build, however, the king sort of trumps his own charter with Winthrop and regrants much of that land to his brother James, the Duke of York. Right? James sees what is happening in Connecticut and also wants greater control of the British colonies in general and covets New Amsterdam and New Netherlands. And so with that grant of 1664 from his brother, he sends a fleet over to take New Amsterdam and New Netherlands from the Dutch. When that happens, Stuyvesant finds himself facing a British fleet, or an English fleet, without any real support. Right? So he stands there. This fleet has shown up under authority from the King of England, demanding the surrender of Fort Amsterdam, and he's prepared to fight. Right? He stands up on the walls of the fort. He's ready to go, and basically his population turns on him. Right? They say, we're not going to fight. We're not willing to risk our lives. His own son signs a document saying that we don't want to fight. They encourage him, rather than engaging the British, to surrender, to avert misery, sorrow, and conflagration by surrendering to the English force. Because they know under the rules of war at that point in time that if they fire a single shot against the forces that are laying siege to them, that the English forces have the right to go in and basically just burn the town to the ground. So as soon as they fire, they know it's over for them. And so Stuyvesant's own son says, don't do it. And so Stuyvesant, recognizing that he has lost, surrenders. And you have about 1,500 residents of New Amsterdam at that point. And they watch as Stuyvesant surrenders to Richard Nichols, who had been sent by the Duke of York to surrender, or to claim the fort for the English. What's striking is that when Nichols raises the English flag and renames the place in honor of his patron, the Duke of York and Albany, that the crowd includes a man named Anthony the Turk Van Sally, who's a half-Moroccan former pirate who's now a wealthy landowner in New Netherlands. You have Acer Levy, who was a Polish Jew who owned Manhattan's first kosher butcher shop. And you have Manuel Garrett, who is an African who owns a small farm on the edge of the city. So even there, in that moment, as the surrender takes place, you see the diversity. I mean, it's a small scale, but it's there already, right? And these are people who recognize that it's in their best interest not to fight. This is not an ideological endeavor. It's pragmatic, right? In their resistance or in their decision not to resist the ruler. Right? This, I think, provides a stark contrast with New England and with Virginia. And I just quickly want to describe New England and Virginia to come back to my larger point. Puritan New England was just that, right? It was Puritan. They believed themselves to be a chosen people. They came over with their own established families, their own established communities. They saw themselves as providing an example, right? This is the city upon a hill stuff. But that city upon a hill was a Puritan city upon a hill. A Puritan example. This is what happens when you let God's chosen people run things, right? You have a high literacy rate and people who can afford to be there. They believed heavily in the family unit, right, as I mentioned. They actually passed laws prohibiting living alone because the family was so important, right, that if you have a young single man living by himself, there's no telling what he can do. But if he's in his father's house, the father can keep control of things, right? Marriage was a civil rather than a religious ceremony, right? It was all within sort of their own context. Right? So if you violate the contract, divorce is fairly easy. You see a lot of New England newspapers that say, you know, my husband not having been in my bed for 3 years, I now declare myself divorced, right? So these are the kinds of things that you would see. They were close-built towns, right, centered on the town green, and it was about a communitarian sort of collective. It wasn't simple majoritarian democracy. You generally didn't have democratic votes in these New England town meetings. It was sort of just the will of the town. That's how they often wrote it, right? It is the will of the town that this happened. They didn't tell you that the vote was 51-49 or something like that, right? And this is different. And this is, David Hackett Fisher has written a book called Albion Seed, and he takes these ideas from, you know, what these places are, right? So what he says in New England is that they have an ordered liberty. This is their concept of liberty. The collective obligation to protect the individual from the tyranny of circumstance, right? Basically, nobody should get stuck with bad luck, right? If something bad happens, the community should come out to help them, right? They voted to tax themselves at higher rates to make this a reality, right? This was not seen, right, depending on your political persuasion, this is socialism, right, this is welfare. But this is a freedom from fear, right? This idea that you know that if something bad happens, there's somebody there to catch you, to take care of you, right? But this, in a lot of ways, is different than, you know, you might say America is today, right or wrong, but it's different, right? Virginia is also a very different place. I'm doing this to provide a juxtaposition, right? The Virginia culture, and again, much of this is David Hackett Fisher's on New England and Virginia. When William Berkeley arrived in 1642, he remade Virginia into his image. And really what he's doing is bringing royalist elites who had lost the English Civil War to come over and try to sort of recreate England abroad, right? They wanted to maintain the class system. They imported indentured servants to work in the fields. Later, of course, they would begin to use slaves. All of this was to maintain that core identity, right? With themselves, these nobility at the top, right? And of course, it's the king's supporters who call themselves the Cavaliers who come over and settle Virginia, and why today the University of Virginia is still the Cavaliers. The Anglican faith, as you might expect, dominated political life. As much as the Puritan faith dominated in New England, the Anglicans dominated in Virginia. Right? Quakers and Puritans were actually banished from Virginia. And they kept them out basically until the Great Awakening of the 1730s. Marriage was seen as a sacred union. Divorce was nearly impossible. It was a religious ceremony and massive feasts. And about 20% of women were pregnant on their wedding day. As long as you got married, it's okay. That's basically the way it worked. They believed in education, but only for the elite, right? Not for the general population. And you can sort of see how the literacy rates play out, right? The further down you go, the lower the literacy rate. And what this comes to, again from Fisher, is this idea of hegemonic liberty. Freedom, this looks very, I think, foreign to us in a lot of ways. Freedom was the power to rule and not be overruled by others, right? Freedom was power, basically. It was the opposite of slavery. And it was a gift to the well-born Englishmen who were a breed apart, the ones who could enslave others. This is different than New England, but both, I think, are very different than what you see in New York. Right? What you see in New York and what you saw in New Amsterdam and New Netherlands was what I would call a pragmatic liberty. Right? This idea that liberty came about as a response to changing circumstances, to the sort of challenges of a republic, to trying to manage different groups in the same place. Right? That if you were going to have a republic in the form of the Dutch, or if you were ultimately going to have a republic in the United States, and I think Madison touches on this in Federalist 10, right? When he sort of says, look, faction is what's going to protect liberty. Because you have all of these different groups competing for their interests. And if you have so many different groups competing in one place, it's going to help keep any one group from coming to dominate. Right? And so this sort of pragmatic liberty, I think, is a guiding piece of what you see in the Netherlands, what you see in New Amsterdam, and I think what you ultimately see in much of the United States today. Right? Do you have religious toleration because they're there? Right? You don't necessarily wholly agree, but you tolerate them because they're a part of your place. You have pluralism. You see economics as driving much of this. And you ultimately see balancing the needs of the community in face of a changing environment. Right? You see that in response to the various rulers in the forms of the directors of New Netherlands. You see it when the British arrive. Right? There's a pragmatism there. Let's move beyond this. It doesn't matter who's in charge. Let's just keep running things and moving them forward. And in fact, the Dutch would come back and for about a year take back New Netherlands and then lose it again to the British. But the city just kept on going. The colony just kept on going because it was this sort of pragmatic approach to things that kept things moving. And so what I think, and what I've argued here today, or tried to argue, is that what you end up with is this tradition built and growing out of the Dutch Republic formation, that diversity in some ways leads to liberty, which allows for more diversity, which allows for more liberty. And that moving things forward requires a kind of pragmatism that would otherwise result in bloodshed and violence to try to sort of keep it under control. And so what I want to leave you with, and then I'll take a few questions, is that what you get out of the Dutch tradition, what you get from the history of New Amsterdam and New Netherlands more broadly, is this sort of pragmatic approach to running and allowing for liberty. And while it's not the sole cause of who we've come to be as Americans, I think it's a critical piece and a lesson that we've carried forward into the 21st century. Thank you. Yeah.
I know you mentioned slavery in Virginia.
Yes.
But the Dutch had slaves and the New Englanders
Yes, they did.
had slaves too.
Yes.
When were the slaves introduced in those?
From the very beginning, yes. And I glossed over it to a degree, and this is in some ways a great omission that we often make. And in my larger class, I always try to come back and say, look, there's slavery there too. The key piece, and I think the critical factor in this, is that you have these sort of societies with slaves rather than a slave society. New England and New York becomes one of the great hubs, actually, of the slave trade, as does Rhode Island. But it's not a place that sort of opens itself up to plantation agriculture. So it's there, and slavery is sort of never good in any form. But it doesn't become sort of defining characteristic of the place. Whereas in the American South, and certainly in the Caribbean, both for the British, for the French, for the Dutch, slavery dominates the Caribbean, and this is where they're making most of their money for the empires. But it's there, it's just not sort of the foundational core of what these places are. Although, like I said, both New England and New York make a lot of money out of the slave trade.
The Dutch maintain the ability to still be liberal to this day, for all those years, surrounded with all those countries that have so much aggravation and such religious intolerance.
Yeah, I think it is their Republican structure. I gave you sort of a simplified version here in talking about the empire, and they did go through periods of struggle and strife, and they got engaged in these wars. And there were periods of less toleration and less liberty. But I think in sort of allowing for that diversity, allowing for that sort of regional change, allowed them to sort of maintain that core. And if you go by sort of classical political philosophy, they were small enough too, right? The sort of traditional view was small republics work best, and this is what Madison is trying to turn on its head with the support for the Constitution, is that, you know, a large republic can work. But in some ways it might be their size as well.
Just finished reading with a class the Second Treatise of Government by John Locke. And although I knew he was in the Netherlands just before he publishes them, I had never asked myself, and so I'm asking you.
Yeah.
It's a little off the topic, but with so much emphasis on trade and toleration, those are the two driving things, and with a central focus on property, of the Second Treatise and then the letter on toleration.
Yeah.
Do you know of any evidence that he was influenced by the Dutch, because he was living there? Great Britain tried to get him extradited, but
I mean, I don't know of any sort of, I can't point to something and say here it is, but if you look at sort of the stuff that's going on with Grotius and this idea of, you have these ideas are already sort of floating around, right? Van der Donck is sort of immersed in these ideas, and I would imagine that Locke is sort of drawing on these same connections, you know. And this is, in fact, we just had a discussion yesterday in my American Revolution class, or Thursday, in my American Revolution class, talking about the fact that Jefferson is sort of drawing on all of these things that are already there. So it's there. If you're an educated person, you're getting exposed to these ideas or getting engaged in these conversations.
Continuing off the point, at about that time, or maybe a generation after, the Dutch had an active movement towards South Africa. Mm-hmm. What was the motivation for that? And that was a denial of the liberty that they were so committed to.
And that I don't know. I don't know the Dutch history well enough to sort of talk about their expansion into empire. I mean, I think some of it may just been competition within Europe, and this idea that Africa doesn't count, right? If Africa is then divided up among the Europeans a little bit later, it's done with this idea that Africa isn't worthy of this consideration. And what's interesting is the two places that get left alone in the 19th century partitioning of Africa are Ethiopia, because they believe they have a Christian king, and Liberia because it was an American slave, where ex-slaves could go for freedom. So I think it must have been tied, and I don't know for sure, to this notion that, you know, where they're Christian, it's fine. Where they're not, it doesn't count. But like I said, I'm just speculating.
Michael Hartz and all sorts of academics sort of hope that we live in a Lockean America. Why do you think this critical Dutch component has been sort of lost in our pedagogy? And like why, Grotius, Vanderbilt, drawing on him, and why is that not really taught in our canon?
Because they lost. No, it's. Oh, sure. Why isn't this sort of part of our standard narrative, right? Why don't the Dutch get as much credit as they do? You have New Englanders who are sort of the earliest, right? You have John Adams' grandson writing this history, and well, who's going to be the hero of this story, right? It's New Englanders who are the first to sort of write the history of America, and so well, it's New England then that's the center of all of this, right? That's where we're coming from, and so it's in a lot of ways a question about who's writing. The other issue too is the issue of sources. The Dutch sources are only just in the last generation starting to be translated into accessible English for scholars, and this makes a big difference. So that's part of it too.
In drawing on Adams, because he spent time there, was he personally influenced, do we know?
I think probably. I mean, right, he comes out and says that, look, they're very similar. It's the same kind of place. So that's probably part of it as well. Yeah. I also cheated a little bit. I'll make one final point. Pennsylvania, right? I mean, the Quakers come over and they use this idea of religious toleration, right? They have their frame of government that says, yeah, come on over. And so in a lot of ways, Pennsylvania is a part of this as well, right? And the middle colonies together collectively become sort of this place where all of this sort of mixes together. Although the Quakers were a little less, Stuyvesant didn't like this toleration, but everybody else said this is how it has to be. The Quakers allowed for the toleration because they were waiting for the day when everybody said, oh, wait, I should be a Quaker. But you couldn't force them to do it, right? So it's a slightly different impulse behind the two. But that I wanted to sort of make that caveat because Pennsylvania is as much a part of this sort of middle colony liberty, I think, as New York is.
Yeah, could you talk a little bit more about pragmatism and how was this a very American idea or habit, and how does it connect perhaps with pluralism?
I mean, I think in the context of the Dutch, that's exactly what pluralism was. It was pragmatic because you had these different groups coming in, they contributed to the economy, they were investing in things like the West India Company. It just made sense to do it. In the case of what became New York, look, we don't like this governor fighting the Indians because it's hurting our business, so let's get him out. Well, the British are here, well, does it make more sense to fight or just to say, come on, take over, and we'll continue on doing what we're doing? So I think it fits then, and I think today when we do things well as a country, I think it's when we understand the context of what's happening and don't just say, well, this is the way we do it, so this is what's going to happen. It's when you take in all the information and make an informed choice that I think things work the best.
One time, about 20 years ago, on a drive down to Penn State on NPR, I can't give you the source, but the fellow said that the success of our democracy is attributed to the fact that the religious group in New England wanted everybody to be able to read the Bible. So the fact that they had to learn, they had to become literate on that basis, he said that's the reason why we have been so successful.
Yes, and that's part of, and I don't deny the sort of the value of New England. And certainly this is the cradle of the revolution. And I think education is a key piece to this. So I think the sort of New England literacy rates, which there were because they wanted to sort of be this example to the world so everybody should learn to read. I think that is a key piece of what America became. I mean, you wouldn't have John Adams without that sort of commitment. And the Adams family is sort of a sort of luminary family within American history. And it comes right out of that tradition. So I think that's probably part of it. But I would argue that you need this part of it as well to sort of bring it all together. And it's that diversity that's allowed for the pluralism and the pragmatism of American history.
any Dutch come to other places in the colonies besides New York? In other words, it's interesting not to have had that kind of influence, particularly with the emphasis on trade,
Right.
anywhere else.
Yeah, and later you would have them, and you had a lot going to the Caribbean. But the government of these other places was explicitly controlled by primarily whether Puritans or Anglicans or even Quakers in Pennsylvania. So you have influence on the frontier and these kinds of things, but not at the same level where they're sort of saying, here's the policy for this region.
So the Dutch didn't continue to come, I mean, to the Middle West?
You still had Dutch coming, but not in the same way. They're also, and I didn't touch on this, loan words, right? Things, the idea of a cookie is a Dutch word. That's why we don't call them biscuits. Santa Claus was originally a Dutch character who has sort of become greater for us. The idea of a boss rather than a master. And Americans took boss to mean something very different than master as you get into the Revolutionary period and later, right? That you have a boss, but he's not your master. And Americans have made that differentiation.
What were the economic consequences of the Dutch losing New York and the British getting it?
Yeah, for the Dutch,
The home country.
yeah, I don't fully know how much that impacted them. It certainly would have been a blow, but they had such wide-ranging colonies. They had other places to make money from. The other piece is that they kept their Caribbean colonies, and that's where the real money for everybody is coming from, because that's where the great wealth is.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up because Amy Chaw in Day of Empire contrasts the way in which, for example, the Dutch and the British maintained their empires. And if you think about it, the pragmatism of the Dutch with the assimilation and the tolerance, in a sense it was a very different type of colonial experience than, for example, what the British did in India. So it's a very interesting kind of contrast, and it, I think, complements quite well what you're presenting here. Of course, as a Brooklyn girl, we remember the Dutch quite fondly.
Yes, of course, especially in Brooklyn. All right. I think we should stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think this was a wonderful beginning to our America in the world, and thank you so much. Thank you. Very illuminating. Yeah. We can take a coffee break now, and we'll be back with the next lecture in about 20 minutes.